In June 1950, the United States Air Force had a problem that shouldn't have existed. They owned the most advanced jet fighters on Earth. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star could fly circles around any propeller-driven aircraft. It represented the future of air combat. But when North Korea invaded South Korea, American commanders made a desperate decision that shocked military planners worldwide. They pulled hundreds of World War II fighters out of desert storage and shipped them to the battlefield. Why would the world's most technologically advanced Air Force abandon its jet fighters for obsolete propeller planes? The answer reveals a brutal truth about military technology. Newer doesn't always mean better. This is a story of how the P-51 Mustang proved that speed isn't everything, and why the wrong airplane became the right weapon for a modern war. Let's start with what everyone got wrong about the future of air combat. When World War II ended in 1945, military strategists around the world reached the same conclusion. The age of propeller fighters was over. Jets were faster, more powerful, and represented the inevitable evolution of aerial warfare. The U.S. Air Force bet everything on this assumption. They scrapped thousands of perfectly functional aircraft. The P-47 Thunderbolt, one of the most durable ground attack planes ever built, was almost entirely destroyed. Crews used acetylene torches and steel plates dropped from cranes to smash them into scrap metal. The P-51 Mustang barely survived this purge. Thousands were sold for as little as $1,500 each, less than the cost of a new car. During the war, each Mustang had cost the government $51,000 to produce. The Air Force kept only jet fighters operational. The future seemed clear. Then came Korea, and the future stopped working. F-80 Shooting Stars arrived over Korean battlefields with critical problem. They could only stay there for minutes. The round trip from Japan consumed most of their fuel. Pilots would arrive over enemy positions, barely have time to identify targets, then immediately turn back to base. Ground troops calling for air support watched American jets appear overhead, make a single pass, and disappear. Meanwhile, enemy forces continued attacking. But fuel consumption wasn't the only issue. Early jet engines required long, smooth runways. Korean airfields were rough, short, and frequently damaged by artillery. Jets attempting to operate from forward bases ingested debris and suffered catastrophic engine failures. The sleek, expensive future of air combat couldn't handle the dirty reality of war. Someone remembered the Mustangs sitting in desert storage facilities across America. Within weeks, the Air Force loaded 145 Mustangs onto the aircraft carrier USS Boxer. The ship departed California on July 14, 1950, and reached Japan just 8 days later, the fastest trans-Pacific crossing by an aircraft carrier in history. By late July, P-51 Mustangs were flying combat missions over Korea. The obsolete propeller fighter could do everything the modern jets couldn't. Loiter over battlefields for hours, operate from crude forward airstrips, carry massive bomb loads, and provide the close air support that ground troops desperately needed. But this success came with a terrible price that highlights why the Mustang should never have been sent to war. Here's what most people don't understand about the P-51 Mustang. It was never designed for the kind of fighting it did in Korea. The Mustang was a high-altitude escort fighter. Its liquid-cooled Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was supercharged to perform at 25,000 feet, where it could protect bomber formations from enemy interceptors. In Korea, Mustangs flew ground attack missions at extremely low altitudes, hunting tanks and supply convoys through small arms fire. This was like using a Formula One race car for off-road rally racing. It could do the job, but it wasn't built for it. Ed Schmud, the brilliant engineer who had designed the Mustang, watched in frustration from California. He later said that using the P-51 for ground support was nearly suicidal because of one critical vulnerability: the liquid cooling system. Unlike air-cooled radial engines, which could absorb significant battle damage and continue running, the Merlin engine depended on a radiator filled with coolant. A single bullet through that radiator meant the engine would overheat and seize within 2 minutes. There was no limping back to base, no gliding to safety. Pilots had seconds to bail out or die. The statistics tell the story. 335 F-51 Mustangs were lost in Korea. 264 pilots were killed or went missing. Of those losses, 172 fell to enemy ground fire, rifles and machine guns destroying aircraft that enemy fighters couldn't touch. The Air Force had made a catastrophic mistake after World War II. They had scrapped their P-47 Thunderbolts, which had air-cooled radial engines perfect for ground attack. The Navy had kept its F-4U Corsairs for exactly this reason. The Mustang was what the Air Force had. So the Mustang went to war. Korean winters made conditions even worse. Brutal cold and frequent icing at low altitudes created a virtual death sentence for overloaded aircraft. The Mustangs lacked de-icing systems. Wing ice accumulated rapidly, and an aircraft entering a stall or spin almost never recovered. On the ground, conditions at forward bases were equally deadly. Pilots and mechanics lived in unheated tents. Some airmen rigged improvised heating systems using aviation fuel. The predictable result: fires and explosions that killed men who had survived combat. Yet despite these appalling conditions, the Mustang accomplished its mission. North Korean troops learned to fear the sound of that Merlin engine. They feared napalm most of all, a hybrid mixture with thermite developed by the 51st Fighter Interceptor Squadron that burned hot enough to melt rubber off tank wheels. The punishing attacks forced enemy forces to move only at night and hide everything during daylight hours. Soldiers drove tanks into houses and haystacks to escape the Mustangs circling overhead. By 1953, jet fighter bombers finally replaced the Mustang in American service. The F-84 Thunderjet and F-86 Sabre took over ground attack duties. But here's what makes this story remarkable. While America retired its Mustangs, the rest of the world was just getting started with them. Between 1945 and 1984, the P-51 Mustang fought in more conflicts than almost any other aircraft in history. Not as a museum piece, not as a training aircraft, as a frontline combat fighter. Let me give you a sense of just how widespread this was. Israel used Mustangs to fight for its survival during the 1948 War of Independence. Israeli agents smuggled 4 Mustangs out of the United States by creating them as farm equipment labeled combines. Within days of assembly, they became Israel's best fighters, faster and longer range than anything Arab armies could deploy. On November 20th, 1948, an American volunteer pilot named Wayne Peake intercepted a British reconnaissance aircraft at high altitude and shot it down. It was a message. Israeli airspace now belonged to Israel. But the most extraordinary Mustang mission happened during the 1956 Suez Crisis. Israeli commanders needed to destroy Egyptian communication lines running through the Sinai Desert. Someone designed a special device, a weight dragged on a cable behind the aircraft to snag and cut telephone wires. During the actual mission, some devices fell off. The pilots didn't abort. Instead, they flew even lower and used their wings and propeller blades to slice through the wires directly. At that altitude, measured in feet rather than hundreds of feet, a single mistake meant instant death. But they succeeded, severing Egyptian communications across the entire Sinai, just as Israeli paratroopers dropped at the Mitla Pass. The Mustang had become a wire cutter. Meanwhile, in the Dominican Republic, something even stranger was happening. The Dominican Air Force received its first Mustangs in 1948 and kept flying them until 1984, 40 years after the aircraft's operational debut. They became the longest operating Mustang force in the world, outlasting every other nation, including the United States. In 1983, when a Cuban intelligence ship refused to leave Dominican waters, the Dominican Air Force responded with the only weapons they had: their ancient Mustangs. They strafed the ship until it departed. Cuba retaliated by sending supersonic MiG-21 jets to buzz Dominican air bases. The Mustang pilots knew better than to fight jets with propeller fighters. As one pilot later recalled, "We went inside and hid until the MiGs went away." But before the Dominicans finally retired their Mustangs, the aircraft fought one last war, the strangest aerial combat of the modern era. July 1969. American astronauts were preparing to land on the moon. In Vietnam, supersonic jets fought with radar-guided missiles. The age of propeller fighters seemed like ancient history. Then El Salvador and Honduras went to war over a soccer match. I'm not exaggerating. A World Cup qualifying series triggered riots that escalated into a full-scale invasion. On July 14, 1969, El Salvador attacked Honduras with an air force that looked like it belonged in a museum. Honduras flew F-4U Corsairs, the bent-wing Navy fighters from World War II. El Salvador had Corsairs of their own, plus a small force of modernized P-51 Mustangs called Cavalier Mustangs. What followed was the last aerial combat between propeller-driven fighters in history. On July 17th, Captain Fernando Soto of the Honduran Air Force was flying his fourth ground attack mission of the day when one of his wingmen reported jam cannons. Soto ordered the wingman, Captain Zapita, to return to base alone. That's when two Salvadoran Mustangs spotted him. They dove to attack. Zapita, defenseless with jam cannons, threw his aircraft into desperate evasive maneuvers while screaming for help on the radio. Soto heard him. He and his remaining wingmen jettisoned their bombs and dove to the rescue. The lead Salvadoran pilot, Captain Douglas Varela, was concentrating on Zapita, trying to line up a kill shot. He never saw Soto coming down behind him. Soto opened fire with 20mm cannons. Shells tore into the Mustang. Varela's aircraft went down. The second Mustang pilot tried to escape. Soto chased him down and destroyed him too. 2 kills in minutes. But Soto wasn't finished. After the dogfight, Soto continued toward his original target area. He spotted 2 Salvadoran Corsairs returning from a mission. He engaged and shot down both of them. Fernando Soto scored 3 confirmed aerial victories that day, 1 Mustang and 2 Corsairs. They were the last kills ever made in combat between propeller-driven fighters. His aircraft, F-4U 5 No. 609, is preserved today at the Honduras Air Museum with 3 kill markings painted beneath the cockpit. The war ended the next day. More than 3,000 people died in 100 hours of fighting. But aviation history had witnessed something remarkable. The aerial battles of World War II replayed one last time over Central American jungles, 24 years after the Great War had ended. After 1969, the combat career of the P-51 Mustang was finally over, but the airplane itself refused to die. Today, there are more than 160 airworthy P-51 Mustangs flying worldwide. Most of them are over 80 years old. They appear at air shows from Wisconsin to New Zealand. They race at Reno, Nevada, regularly exceeding 450 miles per hour, faster than they ever flew during the war. Tom Cruise owns one and flies it himself. An airworthy P-51 now costs between $2 and $4 million. Historic examples with documented combat records have sold for more than $5 million. Why do these aircraft still fly when every other fighter from their era is grounded in museums? The answer reveals something important about how we preserve history. In 1945, a teenager named Ed Maloney watched crews destroy perfectly good B-17 bombers at Calero Field in California. Steel plates fell from cranes and cleaved fuselages in two. He also saw house-sized mounds of technical manuals being burned. He vowed to save as many aircraft as possible. While working odd jobs, Maloney scraped together money to buy old warboats one at a time. On January 12, 1957, he opened his collection to the public, the first aviation museum west of the Rockies. Maloney died on August 19, 2016. It was National Aviation Day, established to honor the birthday of Orville Wright. His sons and the children of his friends continue his work. His museum now holds more than 50 aircraft, many in flying condition. Maloney wasn't alone. Across America and around the world, former pilots and mechanics rescued Mustangs from junkyards, foreign air forces, and crash sites. They learned to maintain Merlin engines that Rolls-Royce stopped producing decades ago. The warbird restoration movement grew into a global phenomenon. In 2013, a pilot named Doug Matthews set a world altitude record for piston-engine aircraft in a Mustang named the Rebel. He climbed to 42,568 feet over Florida. The aircraft was nearly 70 years old. It performed flawlessly. That record still stands today. The P-51 Mustang was designed in 102 days to meet an urgent British request in 1940. It was supposed to be a stopgap until better fighters could be developed. Instead, it became the defining American fighter of World War II. After the war, it was supposed to be scrapped and forgotten. Jets were the future. Instead, it fought in Korea, Israel, the Suez, Indonesia, Central America, and the Dominican Republic. It cut telephone wires with its propeller blades. It fought the last dogfight between propeller fighters in history. Today, it still flies because people refuse to let it die. Machines are not supposed to outlive their purpose by 8 decades. But the Mustang has. It survives because preservationists like Ed Maloney rescued airframes from scrapyards. Because pilots flew obsolete fighters into combat one last time. Because restorers spend years rebuilding wrecks. Because collectors invest millions to keep Merlin engines turning. The factory in Englewood, California, closed in 1945. The last new Mustang rolled off the line 80 years ago. But the sound of that engine, the howl of 12 cylinders at full power, still fills the sky. That's the real story of what happened to the P-51 Mustang after World War II. It didn't just survive. It proved that obsolescence is a choice, not a destiny. If this story changed how you think about military technology, hit the like button. Subscribe for more untold military history. And tell me in the comments, have you ever seen a warbird fly in person? What was it like? Thanks for watching.